In 1888, a series of murders in the East End of London rocked England. The killings soon made headlines as the Whitechapel Murders, and quickly were attributed to a mysterious individual, later dubbed Jack the Ripper. Despite a vast manhunt, no conclusive suspect was identified. Over the years, a variety of theories have developed, from the intriguing to the absurd. It has been largely presumed that the criminal was a sociopath, with some sort of intense sexual disorder. Nothing has been proven. But no one has considered a suspect hiding in plain sight. No one has considered the Wigmaker of Wellington Street. In 1893, Willy Clarkson was at the top of his game as a wig maker, costume maker and barber. Just 5 years earlier, Clarkson had been appointed as the royal perruquier and costumier to Queen Victoria. He was in great demand, and his wigs and costumes appeared in plays throughout London's West End. His large shop on Wellington Street was covered by autographs of the most famous celebrities of the time. Willy's lifelong dreams had come true. Willy Clarkson was born in 1861 as William Berry Clarkson to Eliza Berry and William Henry Clarkson. The elder Clarkson was an ambitious wig maker and costumer in the Covent Garden area of London. Clarkson's grandfather was reportedly a barber surgeon, and though he died years before Clarkson was born, his valuable anatomical books and surgical tools would surely have been kept by the family as heirlooms, available to the young Willy, who was often left alone to explore and find lonely mischief. The art of wiggery was introduced to Willy early in his childhood. Instead of toys, his father allowed him only a wig to play with, and taught him how to thread a needle and place hair in a wig. Willy acted as a courier for his father, and in his youth expertly manoeuvred the nooks, crannies and back alleys of Victorian London, with customers and vendors throughout the city. Wigs were young Willy's life, and the streets were his playground. When young Willy was at school learning French in Paris, he was called back home after his father fell ill. Young Willy took over the business and by 14 was the new Clarkson in Wigs by Clarkson. He worked relentlessly and grew his father's modest business. Success quickly followed. Though he grew to be quite large as an adult, Willy was fair and genteel in his youth. His hair and skin were light. He has been described as effeminate in manner, but was also described as broad-shouldered with a barrel chest, though only around 5'5" tall. There has been much speculation throughout the years that he was gay and Jewish, both of which could have profoundly impacted his career if made public. He was engaged to a woman named Jenny Glover, and she would send him affectionate notes when they were apart, but the engagement ended. Willy took to lurking in shadows, stalking his ex-fiancée and her new betrothed, and wore the diamond ring he gave her for the rest of his life. Despite this disturbing behaviour, Clarkson's career continued to expand. When Queen Victoria appointed Clarkson the royal wig maker and costume maker in 1888, a great ambition had been met, but it was just the beginning. Known as the wig maker of Wellington Street, Clarkson was glamorous and on top of the world. Perhaps he would stop at nothing to stay there. In 1888, there was another side of London, a rough one. The streets were filled with ruffians and con artists, pimps and prostitutes, soldiers and fugitives. Danger was everywhere, particularly in the decrepit East End. On the 7th of August 1888, the body of a woman, later identified as Martha Tabram, who had fallen into a life of poverty and occasional prostitution, was found murdered in George Yard in the seedy East End. The killing was particularly brutal. The woman stabbed dozens of times with a sharp blade like a penknife, or a small scalpel a barber surgeon would use. Many historians agree this was the first murder of the infamous Jack the Ripper. The circumstances of the death have been exhaustively examined. Prior theories largely rely on the belief that Martha was a random victim, a crime conducted by an individual with sociopathic tendencies seeking to satisfy sexual urges. But perhaps the death was not random or sexual. Despite the mythology of the terrible crimes, the Whitechapel murders did not appear to include sexual assaults, but were simply luridly brutal. Perhaps the killer was someone who knew the victim, a rational perpetrator killing for a rational reason, to silence particular victims, for a particular purpose, as lucid as it was ruthless. The date of Martha's murder is critical, as it occurred the day after Willy Clarkson appeared in the pages of the Evening Telegraph, described in the headline as "The Wigmaker of Wellington Street." The story makes clear that Clarkson was a famous and well-respected member of society, making wigs for the wealthy and royal. Princess Beatrice's name is specifically mentioned. Moreover, the Telegraph article revealed that Clarkson often provided disguises for members of Scotland Yard. His store is described as vast and filled with valuable merchandise. Literally thousands of wigs and costumes for a variety of uses, from theatre to hoaxes to covering up black eyes for desperate wealthy clients who required discretion. Is it possible that Martha learned of the Telegraph article published the day before her death, and may have known Clarkson but was not previously aware of his true wealth and social status? Maybe she and her partner at the time considered this new knowledge could increase the value of her information. But how could a poor woman who had fallen into poverty and prostitution come to know an upper-class wigmaker of great fame? Vastly different from his reputation as a high-class wigmaker and costumier, Willy Clarkson had a dark side. In 1886, 2 years before the Whitechapel murders began, Clarkson met William Cooper Hobbs, a most unsavoury character who worked for a solicitor in an office next to Clarkson's wig shop. Subsequent years proved that Hobbs and Clarkson were almost certainly allies in crime, accused of a variety of crimes including fraud, arson and blackmail. Hobbs was known to consort with a variety of criminals with exotic names like the Monocled Man and the Human Ape, and was said to have organised extensive gambling and burglary rings. In 1919, Hobbs, likely with Clarkson's cooperation, perpetrated an infamous blackmail scheme, targeting the famous Harry Singh, who was to become the ruling Maharaja of Kashmir and who the court would identify only as Mr. A to avoid a public scandal. Singh paid Hobbs and his gang £300,000 after Hobbs threatened to reveal a romantic liaison between the married presumptive Maharaja and a young woman in a Paris hotel. The young woman, Maud Robinson, was separated from her husband and had begun to fall into poverty, vulnerable to an invitation to extortion. The blackmailing scheme was soon revealed and Singh's identity was publicly disclosed. Hobbs and several other persons were implicated. Clarkson's close relationship with Hobbs strongly suggests he was involved in the extortion of the presumptive Maharaja, but he was never charged, managing to remain in the shadows. Hobbs was sentenced to 2 years in penal servitude, but was soon back on the streets and returning to his old ways. In the 1920s, Hobbs and Clarkson also allegedly blackmailed wealthy married men who were caught in compromising positions in public baths near Clarkson's shop. Because of the extent of the pair's blackmail, the public baths were dubbed Clarkson's Cottages, a place where gay men met other gay men in a time when gay sex was illegal. Exposure could cost a man his reputation, his family, or even his life. It was the perfect opportunity for blackmail. Is it possible that Clarkson and Hobbs' blackmailing proclivities started decades earlier, retaining desperate women to entice married men into extramarital affairs, and using this information for blackmail? Perhaps Martha Tabram was one of these women and had come to seek more money from Clarkson after learning from the Telegraph article of his substantial fame, fortune and connection to the police. If so, this could have provided Clarkson with sufficient motive to kill and hedge his risks, killing with stark brutality to intimidate his other informants. This speculation is not alone sufficient to establish convincing connections between Clarkson and the Whitechapel murders. Can evidence be discerned from the lives of the other victims? The growing likelihood of a pattern and relationship between Clarkson and the Whitechapel murders becomes clearer on September 30th, 1888, the night the fourth and fifth women were killed by a figure known as Jack the Ripper. On the 30th of September, Catherine Eddowes was killed at Myrtle Square in a gruesome knife killing that is widely accepted as being one of the Whitechapel murders. Catherine was born in 1842 and her family moved to London the following year. She eventually met a man and had 2 children, living and working for several years in Birmingham. She began to drink heavily, however, and was forced to leave her family. She returned to London and soon met another man. The two roamed the city's streets, frequenting lodging houses, casual wards and workhouses. She worked as a domestic servant and charwoman for Jewish neighbourhood families, learning Yiddish herself, creating abundant opportunity to find information that might prove valuable to a blackmailer like Clarkson. Financially desperate and a vulnerable alcoholic, it is not difficult to speculate on why she would be an attractive target for Clarkson to engage as an informant. 2 of the earlier victims of the Whitechapel murders also fit this profile. Anne Chapman and Mary Ann Nichols lived relatively staid middle-class lives until misfortune forced them into the street. Both became destitute, living in workhouses or lodging houses that required nightly rent payments, often resorting to the streets to find the few shillings necessary for a roof over their head. Both women lived in the East End and often slept rough under the stars. Like Catherine, Anne Chapman was a domestic servant and would have had access to potential incriminating information and would have been financially distressed enough to trade it for a few shillings. Like Martha Tabram, Mary Ann Nichols likely engaged in prostitution, putting her clients in compromising situations that may have been valuable to Clarkson, as in the Maharaja case years later. The weapon in each of these murders was a sharp instrument around 6 inches, like a set of barber shears or a surgical knife. It would be easy for Clarkson to navigate the different neighbourhoods of the East End and West End without detection. A master of disguise, it would be second nature for Clarkson to wear a poor man's rags on one corner of a street and a rich man's top hat and tails by the time he reached the next corner. Brown-haired one minute, a ginger the next. Compellingly, all of the Whitechapel murders occurred within 3 miles of Willy Clarkson's shop, where he freely roamed since he was a child, and which would have provided him quickly accessible, safe refuge after each crime. Patterns begin to emerge. On the same night and around the same hour that Catherine Eddowes was killed, Elizabeth Stride met her sad demise on Berner Street. Born and raised in Sweden, Elizabeth emigrated to London after receiving a small inheritance following her mother's death. She married a carpenter and the two opened a shop, which was successful until Elizabeth's husband fell ill and passed away. Elizabeth drank heavily. She later found a new partner, but fell into poverty and the two had a tumultuous relationship, often living together on or near Dorset Street. Elizabeth had previously defrauded a variety of people, claiming that she was a survivor of the Princess Alice, an infamous ship disaster, as well as other fraudulent bases to seek charitable contributions. Like Catherine Eddowes, Elizabeth sometimes worked as a domestic servant in neighbourhood houses, providing opportunity to gather valuable information. Without any money or future prospects, and diminished by alcohol, Elizabeth squarely fits Clarkson's grooming profile. Most compellingly, the murderer left behind a revelatory clue at the crime scene: the Berner Street wig, a custom wig that Willy Clarkson himself admitted he made. This is a true smoking gun, a literal calling card with the name of Clarkson's wig shop embroidered within it. According to Clarkson, Scotland Yard brought the wig to his store and he positively identified it. He claimed to have searched for a bill of sale but could not locate one. Of course, if it was Clarkson himself who was the killer, no bill of sale would have existed. Remarkably, the detectives did not follow up on this lead. It has long been posited that the killer was interrupted or distracted after the Elizabeth Stride murder, causing him to flee without concluding some ritual act of sexual brutality. This theory asserts that the murderer needed to find another victim to fulfill his burning, sadistic desires that night. But what if the motive had nothing to do with sexual deviance but was simply about money? If so, the less theatrical killing could have been rushed because the killer had further business plans that night. By this time, the Whitechapel murders were national news. Every beat cop in the city was on alert. Clarkson may have wanted to remove the rest of his informants as quickly as possible to minimize risk of capture. He worked with the police, even providing them disguises for the search, and he may have known they were getting closer. This could be the reason the killer attacked twice in one night. If so, is it possible that Clarkson wanted to conclude all his business of murder in a single night, which included not just 2 targets, but 3? There is some evidence to support such a theory. That night, the killer made a 3rd stop, on Goulston Street, close to the Mitre Square murder scene. While no murder on Goulston Street occurred, 2 pieces of physical evidence suggest a 3rd murder was planned. On the night of the double killing, a portion of a bloodied apron was found near the front of a tenement in Goulston Street. The apron belonged to Catherine Eddowes, who upon inspection was found to be wearing an apron that had a portion of it cleanly cut away, as if cut by a person trained in fabric work, like Clarkson. Historians have linked the apron to the murderer, either to wipe the blood from his hands or perhaps to grimly preserve a portion of Miss Eddowes' body as a souvenir. But what if the fabric was the souvenir itself, accidentally left behind while a disguise was changed? Or a calling card meant to intimidate? Clarkson was known to always take small items as souvenirs during his travels. Indeed, a piece of muslin cloth was found at the site of the murder of both Anne Chapman and Mary Ann Nichols. Muslin was a fabric which at the time was used for theatrical set backgrounds, as well as luxury clothing that a poor working-class woman would be unlikely to wear. Were these also souvenirs or calling cards of a theatrical costumier turned killer? In addition to the apron fragment found on Goulston Street, the police also found a short phrase scrawled in chalk on the wall of a nearby tenement, which read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Anti-Semitism was rampant in London at the time, and it is possible this graffiti was simply a coincidence. But could it have been a warning? Clarkson was likely Jewish, though he denied it. It is possible that Clarkson arranged a meeting on Goulston Street to kill another informant, perhaps one who was aware of his Jewish heritage, but she missed the meeting. Maybe she deduced Clarkson was responsible for the Whitechapel murders and fled from their intended meeting place. Knowing the police would soon find his other murder scene just a couple of streets away, Clarkson may have quickly scrawled the graffiti as a message and threat to this remaining informant before escaping back to his wig shop. To analyse this possibility, it is necessary to consider Mary Jane Kelly and the circumstances of her death, which was the next and likely last of the Whitechapel murders. Mary Jane Kelly was found dead over a month after the previous murders. Of Irish or Welsh descent, she married a collier, but he was killed in a mine explosion. She could not support herself and wandered to Cardiff, where she lived with a cousin who introduced her to prostitution. She eventually relocated to London, where a French woman employed her in a high-class West End brothel. She was described as particularly attractive and finely dressed. She travelled several times to France, as English women in the sex trade sometimes did, and once travelled mysteriously to Paris, with an unknown man for a 2-week trip. Clarkson also frequently travelled to France for work, fitting wigs and costumes for royals and actors. He spoke French fluently, but in a rough Cockney accent. Is it possible that the gentleman who accompanied Mary Jane on her mysterious trip to Paris was Clarkson? Perhaps Clarkson used Mary Jane to lure some wealthy person into a compromising position for extortion purposes. Such a blackmail scheme would be identical to the one used in Paris to ensnare the Maharaja years later. Mary Jane, vulnerable and succumbing to drink, must have been another perfect candidate for Clarkson's blackmail network. Mary Jane eventually found herself no longer working in a West End high-class brothel, but rather relegated to the roughest parts of the East End. She eventually came to live in a back room on seedy Dorset Street, one of the roughest areas of the East End. Mary Jane's residence in 1888 was owned by a man named John McCarthy. McCarthy was a good friend of Marie Lloyd, the young and vastly popular music hall entertainer of the time, and whose mother was a London-based dressmaker and costume designer. Critically, Willy Clarkson also knew Marie Lloyd well, and was so close to her that he introduced her to his close friend and client Sarah Bernhardt at a social gathering, starting a new friendship. Born in the impoverished East End, Marie Lloyd knew these streets as well as Clarkson. Both lived in the area their entire lives, Clarkson in the West End, Lloyd in the East End. Like Clarkson, Lloyd was only 14 years old when she began to work in show business, working in East End music halls before moving to more prestigious theatres in the West End. Marie Lloyd was known to bring her theatre friends drinking with her in the East End. Clarkson surely could have met Mary Jane Kelly at one of these gatherings. Music hall reviews were said to attract prostitutes who hoped to find potential clients in the crowd of the bawdy and rowdy shows. Perhaps Clarkson met some or all of his eventual victims at these reviews. Around midnight on the 9th of November, the night of her death, Mary Jane Kelly returned to her room on Dorset Street with an unknown man. At least 2 people claimed to hear her singing the sad music hall tune, "A Violet Plucked from Mother's Grave." One can almost picture Clarkson sitting on the small bed listening to Mary Jane sing for the final time, perhaps songs she had sung to him years earlier.
Of bygone happy days, and down in the meadow in childhood I would roam, but no one's left to cheer me now within that good old home.
The next morning, Mary Jane's body was found. It was the most brutal of the killings, but the police believed Mary Jane was asphyxiated, and the injuries sustained post-mortem. Body parts seem to have been deliberately placed on and around the bed, and the body moved or rearranged. It was so disturbing it seems as though the scene had been arranged theatrically, staged as a final warning message. The knife used in this murder was considered similar to the one used in the other Whitechapel murders, around 6 inches in length, possibly a surgical knife or barber's shears. A doctor also provided a primitive profile of the likely murderer, one who had substantial physical strength, but in appearance was likely to be inoffensive looking and well dressed, and was likely solitary and eccentric in his habits, living among respectable people. This would be a good way of describing Clarkson. It is theorized that Mary Jane likely knew and trusted her assailant. With the famous Sarah Bernhardt and Marie Lloyd vouching for him as close friends, Clarkson would have been a trusted figure. After the killing of Mary Jane Kelly, the murders seemed to stop. While the press attempted to link several other murders to Jack the Ripper, they are now considered by many to be too different in method and timing to be the same killer. There are a variety of theories as to the abrupt halt of killings, that the murderer was killed or imprisoned, or fled when he realized the story became too big for him to avoid capture. But what if the killings seemed to end only because the police were looking for the wrong victim profile? A prostitute stalked by a sexual sociopath, rather than someone who was killed by a ruthless business person for a rational purpose. Perhaps the killer hadn't stopped at all, but simply changed tactics. In 1897, one of Clarkson's longtime clients, William Terrace, was murdered with a 6-inch knife in front of the Adelphi Theatre. The killing was attributed to a lunatic, who was subsequently confined to a lunatic asylum. But perhaps this was Clarkson's new means of dealing with business problems, astutely outsourcing murder. It is undisputed that the murderer of William Terrace was a failed actor named Richard Archer Prince, with a long history of mental illness. But Prince's motive for the killing was never clear. According to his testimony at his trial, Terrace and other actors occasionally gave money to Prince, ostensibly out of pity. Terrace stopped making payments days before his killing, which many point to as the motive for the killing. Clarkson knew Terrace since the beginning of his career, and Terrace's autograph was one of the many that Clarkson kept in his famous autograph book. Terrace often gambled with Willy Clarkson and famed theatre manager George Eddowes. Terrace and other actors apparently often lost wages, and Eddowes was said to laugh away the debt without collecting, but it would have been quite unusual to be so generous. Perhaps those laughs were only a public face, and Eddowes surreptitiously collected his earnings over a period of time, like a loan shark. Perhaps his associate Willy Clarkson was able to blackmail the vulnerable Richard Prince and force him to collect these gambling payments. After all, Clarkson's longtime partner in crime, William Cooper Hobbs, was said to have operated an extensive gambling ring that would have welcomed such business. When Terrace stopped making payments, perhaps Prince was left with no choice but to kill Terrace or be killed himself. Indeed, Eddowes sent a messenger to the theatre that fateful night with an invitation for Terrace to play chess after the show. Could it be that the messenger was sent to ensure the dastardly deed was done? Tellingly, Prince testified he believed it was either Terrace or him that would die that night. Prince had actually claimed for years prior to the murder that he had been blackmailed, a trade with which Clarkson was well acquainted. At a tea party just weeks before the murder, Prince pointed to his powdered wig and stated mournfully to his host, "It's only this secret sorrow that's made me what I am." At his trial, Prince was surprised when he learned that an unnamed patron retained a lawyer for him, and he stated in open court that this lawyer must have been paid by the party who made him kill Terrace. Perhaps Clarkson arranged a lawyer for Prince to sway the eventual sentence and ensure that Prince was confined to a lunatic asylum. Once the verdict was issued, Clarkson would have been confident his legacy was safe. And so it was. Clarkson's fame and fortune remained with him the rest of his life. He made wigs and costumes for acclaimed theatrical actors and royalty, including ongoing work for Mary Jane Kelly's friend Marie Lloyd and Sarah Bernhardt. He was dubbed King of Wigs by the newspapers and wrote articles on the art of disguise. He received countless thank you notes and wig inquiries from a beguiled theatre community that couldn't get enough of his eccentric style, vanity, and flamboyant charm. In 1934, Willy Clarkson was found in the small flat above his store, lying dead on the bedroom floor in his nightgown with a vicious gash across his forehead. It was unclear whether he fell ill and hit his head or whether foul play occurred. However, his former fiancée's diamond ring, which Clarkson wore every day until his death, was missing, as was £250 he supposedly kept in his rooms. It is clear that Willy Clarkson spent much of his career as a wigmaker living a second life of crime, fraud, arson, and blackmail. Did his sordid resume also include murder? As we have seen, there is evidence that Clarkson had the motive, expertise, and opportunity to commit these horrific crimes. Clarkson was a known blackmailer. If Clarkson had been a blackmailer from the start, there was certainly a motive to remove or intimidate his informants once he perceived them as a threat. Clarkson was a master of disguise and could effortlessly elude identification, as it was his second nature to alter appearances. Clarkson was a barber and wigmaker. whose grandfather was reportedly a barber surgeon, and who would therefore have access to barber shears or surgical knives that fit the profile of the presumed murder weapon. The police trusted Clarkson. He repeatedly worked with Scotland Yard, including on the Whitechapel murders, and would have had easy access to know in which direction the investigation was headed. Plain sight is sometimes the best place to hide. Clarkson admitted he made the Burner Street wig, found at the Elizabeth Stride crime scene. The police inexplicably accepted his statement that he simply couldn't find the sales receipt for the wig and did not dig deeper. All of the victims had reached a desperate stage in their lives and were vulnerable to grooming for Clarkson's blackmailing schemes. There is a clear geographical pattern to the murders. Each killing occurred close to Clarkson's Wellington Street shop. Having grown up just a few miles from the scenes of the crime, Clarkson knew how to maneuver the narrow streets and alleys quickly back to his Wellington Street shop. Known as a most secretive man, Willy Clarkson certainly led a strange life of intrigue. Over 100 years later, it is doubtful whether we will ever know the truth, but the evidence is surely sufficient to speculate that, just perhaps, Jack the Ripper really was Willy Clarkson, the Wigmaker of Wellington Street.